Hello, my name is Matthew Perret, and I'm a freelance conference interpreter working mainly for the European institutions. I'm also a trainer of interpreters specialising in English Retour training and a writer and performer of comedy. But when I started my professional career, it was as a staff interpreter in the European Commission, and I was trained in-house on the stage. So it's a great honour for me to be asked to contribute to this project, because the other contributors that you've seen are actually the people who trained me. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the more practical aspects of a retour. And Monsieur Durand has already given you an outline of some of the concepts, and I'll be following his structure, but looking at some of the pitfalls and some possible tips for retour work as we go along. One of the biggest pitfalls is distraction for the listeners, that the customer is somehow distracted by the fact that the interpreter is not speaking his or her mother tongue. This can be because of the voice quality, because of an unnatural emphasis. Sometimes we fall victim to echoic contamination. In other words, there's something about the rhythm or melody of the source language that we're hearing which is transmitted into the target language. And it's easier for that to happen if the target language is not your mother tongue. You may be rather monotonous in your delivery to the taste of the native speakers listening to you, or you may be over tense. There may be a lot of nervous tension transmitted by your voice. Any hesitation or lack of conviction in the message will also be a distraction for the listener and risks undermining your credibility as a communicator. And if you go into interpreter speak, perhaps having a trailing upspeak, a rising intonation at the end of each sentence because you're not quite sure what's coming next, that can be a distraction for your listener. Or if you go into translationese, using terms that people would only really use if they were translating from another language, and then your listener has to do a retranslation in his or her own head in order to get to a more natural form of expression. So all of these can be a distraction, and perhaps the biggest danger of all is that you will misuse an idiom or a cliche and make yourself sound ridiculous. So what are the tips for working with these kind of pitfalls? You can work on voice coaching to improve the quality of your voice. You can work specifically on the strategic use of intonation, so that you use inflection patterns to communicate in a way that helps your listener rather than distracting him or her. You can signpost using your voice so that the listener will know where exactly you are in the speech, whether you're establishing a contrast or not, whether you're attributing your words to somebody else or they are the speaker's own opinion, and of course when you are finishing your speech rather than just suddenly stopping. Intonation can be very useful with all of those things. Of course, you need to be alert at self-monitoring, recording and listening to yourself, especially when you start out, to be alert to these dangers. And of course, seeking feedback from others. Learning how others hear you will help you to overcome some of these challenges. Another problem for a retour interpreter particularly is a lack of clarity. This could be that you are phonetically unclear in what you're saying. The listener isn't quite sure what word or term you were using. You may be logically unclear. There may be a breakdown in the logical sequence of ideas. This could be because of faulty syntax, so the actual nuts and bolts of the language and expression, or your intonation may not match the natural patterns of a native speaker in a way that will then make the intention of the speech unclear. So even if the words are correct, if you like, the intonation pattern can be confusing or misleading for the listener if it goes wrong. Overall, if you don't inspire confidence because of repetition, hesitation, contradicting yourself, whatever the reason, that will have a serious impact on your credibility for the listener. So what is my tip here? The first thing to remember would be that retour interpreting is still interpreting. It's not a public speaking competition. You still have to be doing all the analysis. Analysis is paramount, as in all interpreting. Another difficulty can be if you fail to deduce or anticipate correctly, or you don't pick up an inference from the original. Sometimes we have a tendency to become more passive when we're listening to our A language or mother tongue. It sort of washes over us because of the very familiarity of it, and that can lead to a tendency for a Retour interpreter to let form prevail over substance. In other words, you end up saying it more or less the same way as in the source language, but translated. This can lead to your listener hearing more or less what was said, but not really knowing why. The tips here are basically to remember that as you add a Retour, you're not only adding a second active language, you're adding a new passive language to your repertoire, which is your mother tongue. And I think a lot of people underestimate quite what the scale of that challenge is, to add a new passive language. You need to research the different cultural backgrounds and registers of all possible speakers of your mother tongue, especially those who don't use your mother tongue the way you do, when it will sound more like a foreign language to you culturally. And also you need to analyse how and why people sometimes don't say what they mean. Somehow they imply what they mean, and you need to be ready to deal with that. There may also be things that are culturally specific to the world of speakers of your mother tongue, and there you need to be ready to innovate linguistically and perhaps come up with something totally new for your listeners in the target language. So a lot of different scenarios there to deal with in different ways, and obviously I can only sort of skim over them in this presentation. Perfectionism is one of the main enemies of a Retour interpreter too. That niggling feeling that there's a better way to say it, that a native speaker would have come up with that wonderful equivalent idiom or nice turn of phrase. And if you have that niggling feeling, that's a distraction for you. You're no longer focusing on the analysis and focusing on doing your job. You're beating yourself up about the fact that you haven't come up with something which was what you were aiming for. So how can we deal with that? My tip there would simply be to be less ambitious, not to be over-ambitious in our use of language. We can go away and learn new things for next time and be inspired by eloquent speakers of our target language, of our B language. But in the current thrust of battle, in the heat of simultaneous, we need to have some good strategies for second best. We need to be able to say things clearly, unequivocally, smoothly, but not always setting our sights as high as we would in our mother tongue. A repertoire of linking phrases and useful meeting phrases will help us there, so that the second best reaction can come more naturally and spontaneously and let us get on with the job of really thinking deeply about what it is that we're trying to communicate. Another danger, depending on one's background and schooling, can be that a Retour interpreter ends up having a word-based approach, a written translator's approach to the task, rather than an interpreter's approach. And here I would just give out the warning that even the right word, or so-called right word, can be misunderstood if the intonation doesn't accompany it properly, as I was mentioning earlier. So seek feedback from your listeners, be inspired by eloquent native speakers of your B language, and refresh your core interpreting skills rather than translation skills, as I was saying earlier. Another danger, it seems like a lot, doesn't it? I'm getting towards the end of the list now, don't worry, is that you crack under pressure. And this is probably one of the worst aspects of Retour interpreting, that unlike an A language interpreter, if you crack, you may not land on your feet. You may not be able to improvise an elegant paraphrase. You may not be able to finish the sentence you've started. You may abort a sentence and restart, what we call repair, which is very distracting for the listener and for anyone taking you on relay, who also has to stop and go back and correct. You may lose track of how you started a very complex, convoluted sentence, perhaps with subordinate clauses. You may fail to improvise a clear but neutral, communicative, non-committal phrase to play for time. For instance, as part of the salami technique, that technique comes much more easily and naturally in our mother tongue. And we may have less sang-froid in general to keep thinking and speaking when we're completely lost. So my tips here would be to make sure that you thoroughly work through different aspects of the salami technique. There may be times when we need to reformulate systematically just to be confident that what we've created in the target language is not contaminated by the source language. We can play the game, finish the sentence you started. There are amazing creative ways that native speakers will find to be able to finish the same sentence that they have embarked on, rather than aborting and repairing. So be inspired by their example and play this game to increase your mental agility so that wherever possible you do finish the same sentence that you started. You can play another game, which is to say the second rather than the first thing that you hear. It forces you to reformulate and can be useful to avoid some of the pitfalls. It can be useful to have a repertoire of elegant fillers, and also to have the confidence, develop the confidence to backload information. This is one example of the salami technique, where perhaps your first slice of salami is wafer thin. You're not giving the customer very much yet, but you keep back that nice, large, satisfying chunk of salami for a little bit later. And that way, the communication process still remains elegant and you're not over-ambitious trying to say too much too soon. Sometimes that backloading can increase the quality of your expression in a second language. Another potential danger is the failure to identify with your listener. I referred to this earlier, the idea that the source form prevails over the substance. There's also danger that the source itself will prevail over the target language when it comes to the crunch, because after all, you're listening to your mother tongue and maybe identifying with the source speaker. This can leave your poor listener thinking, I know that that interpreter knows what he means, but I don't. And that's not a very nice position to leave your customer in. So my tip here is a very social one, involves far less academic exercises or interpreting techniques. It's a lot more fun and one of the most rewarding aspects of working in Retour, I think. My tip here is talk to your listeners. Get to know them, live alongside them, if possible in a country where that language is spoken. But using the internet and modern technology, you can immerse yourself in the world of speakers of a given language without necessarily always having to go there. So do that and enjoy it, and that will increase your motivation to empathise with your listener too. So to recap some of the key elements that I've been looking at. In essence, as Monsieur Durand explained earlier, a good retouriste knows they're good, but also knows they're not as good as an A. So you have second best techniques and strategies. You simplify sometimes. Reformulation can be a safety net. You can be confident there is no calc if you have consciously reformulated. There's also the great imponderable issue of how are we heard? Are we really understood by our listeners? And here I like to imagine the figure of Auntie Doris. Auntie Doris is an intelligent, well-read, curious person who is very interested in what's going on in the world and has a lot of background knowledge, but is completely monolingual. She will not understand what I am trying to explain to her if I do not put it into the kind of English, in this case, that she can understand. If there's any contamination from any other language or any failure to transfer or explain an idea, then she will be struggling. And that's a kind of litmus test for me is, does Auntie Doris really understand what I'm trying to say? Getting feedback from your target audience can really help you to develop as a Retour interpreter. Remember, it's not about showing off or sounding native, and beware of colleagues, for instance, native speakers of your B language, who offer superficial appraisals of your work that focus on accent, vocabulary, and so on. This can be important and useful information, but don't forget that the core activity you're engaged in is one of analysis, and that trumps everything else. So if you are intellectually honest, then your customer will be getting what he or she needs. I think that intellectual honesty is particularly important in the case of some Retour interpreters who are gatekeepers to a lesser used language where things are being channeled through you. So it's very important to remember that honesty in terms of things getting lost along the way. So to sum up, I think what you really need as a Retour interpreter is a sense of proportion. It's all about communication. It's about the core skills of interpreting, as any other interpreting activity is. In Retour, you are more exposed and you are in greater danger of saying something foolish. But if the core skills are applied at a high level, the customer will still believe in you and be grateful to you. Auntie Doris will go home a wiser and more knowledgeable person. And if she can tell you how you helped her, so will you.